Asking all members to come to the floor. We're about to have the clerk to read. Mr. Tarico, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a resolution at the desk pertaining to Article 4, Section 8B of the state's constitution dispensing with the 3 readings on 3 separate days requirement. I would like to move to that item now relative to SB 1 by Senator Smithian.
The item is in order, and the clerk will read.
Resolved that Senate Bill 1 presents a case of urgency as that term is used in Article 4, Section 8B of the Constitution, and the provision of that section requiring that the bill be read on 3 separate days in each House is hereby dispensed with, and is ordered that the bill be placed upon its passage and considered engrossed.
Takes 54 votes. Clerk will open the roll. All those vote who desire to vote. 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 I assume all members are on the floor. All those vote who desire to vote. Green button represents aye. Red button represents no. All those vote who desire to vote. 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 Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 55, noes 8. Resolution is adopted. Mr. Tirico, under motions and resolutions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent to allow Mr. Huffman to take up SB 1 without reference to file for purpose of amendments only. SB 1.
Without objection, clerk will read.
Senate Bill 1 with amendments by Assemblymember Huffman.
Mr. Huffman. Members, if I can have your attention. I think we've had enough time to debate. Mr. Huffman has the mic, has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the amendments to
Without objection, we'll start with set number 2.
Okay.
And then we will return to set 1. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Huffman, before you begin, clerk will read.
Thank you.
Senate Bill 1 with amendments by Assemblymember Huffman, set 2.
Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These amendments, per our agreement with the Senate, will make some clarifying changes to remove contingent enactment language relevant to the Water Rights Bill that is even now being finalized in the Senate. It will add area of origin language, consensus area of origin language that Mr. Nielsen and others have worked on. It will add some language to clarify existing protections relative to the State Board's regulation of diversions on area of origin, and then also limiting the Delta Water Masters Authority to the Delta. These amendments are essential to moving forward, and I'll speak about the merits of the bill in a moment.
Very well. Mr. DeVore.
Question of the amendment author, if I may.
Without objection, sir.
It's my understanding that this amendment may insert the right of this body to vote on whether or not a Delta bypass canal would be constructed, a method of conveyance that would allow the approximately $3 billion we may later be voting on in a bond to actually convey water to places where it's needed. Is that in this amendment set that you're offering?
Thank you for the question. That's not in this set of amendments.
Thank you so much.
Without objection, we'll have a voice vote. All those in favor signify by the normal sign of aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. Amendments are adopted. We will return to set 1. Ms. Huber, for what purpose do you rise? The clerk will read.
Senate Bill 1 with amendments by Assemblymember Huber, set 1.
Ms. Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendments offered to SB 1 are in substance identical to AB 13, which some of you may recall was introduced last week. It's a really straightforward concept. These amendments say that we shall not construct a peripheral canal without a vote of this body. It does not preclude the construction of a peripheral canal, but it does say that we, the legislature, will maintain that oversight and that we will actually vote before a peripheral canal is constructed. And there's 4 reasons why I think you should support this amendment. First, it's what the people want. Second, it ensures legislative oversight. Third, there's a piece in this amendment that also ensures that we're going to know exactly the cost of a peripheral canal before we vote on it. And fourth, this measure will truly protect the Delta. On the first point, on this is what the people of the state want. I want to share with you, and Mr. Speaker, if I may have permission to display postcards from my constituents.
Without objection.
Thank you. At my desk, I have nearly 2,000 postcards that I received from constituents in my district saying that they are against the peripheral canal. This is in addition to the thousands of emails and calls that I have received in my office that indicate that people want to see the legislature make difficult decisions and for us to actually vote and be accountable to our constituents for voting for a peripheral canal. Additionally, there's a news article that was passed out earlier by Assemblymember Buchanan citing a poll. And that poll indicated in August that 85% of those people polled, when asked a question directly about what this bill, SB 1, does, Delta governance and setting up a bunch of unelected bureaucrats to decide whether or not to construct a peripheral canal, 85% of the people polled said that they opposed this bill on the underlying policy. If we accept these amendments, we address that concern because we make sure that as a legislature we retain that right to either approve or disapprove of one of the largest and most expensive projects that can be constructed in California. On the second issue, that it ensures oversight, one of the biggest problems, there's many problems with this water package, but one of the biggest problems is that we are completely delegating our authority for having oversight of the peripheral canal in this package. You've got half of the people in this coalition saying that they support this package because it is a clear path to a conveyance. And then you have half of the people in this coalition saying they support this package because it doesn't explicitly authorize a peripheral canal. The coalition can't even agree on what this package does. This amendment clarifies that, and it says if there's going to be a peripheral canal constructed, we, the 80 elected members in this assembly, are going to have a vote on it so that you know that your voice will be heard through one of your elected representatives. Because as it stands now, if you delegate that authority to this unelected bureaucratic body, the Delta Stewardship Council, then all those folks in the Delta who currently have elected representatives that are making sure that their voice is heard in this process, all of them are going to be left out. The third one, the reason why you need to support this amendment, is because you really will know the cost. In this very simple, straightforward amendment, and they're on your computer if you want to look at it, it's a short 3-4 paragraphs, it states that it will be a requirement prior to the vote for the peripheral canal that the Legislative Analyst Office will do a nonpartisan fiscal analysis of exactly how much it's going to cost. Before you pass the buck on this project and allow some other council to decide, you need to know exactly how much it's going to cost your Southern California ratepayers.
Ms. Huber, 30 seconds.
Thank you. Finally, it'll truly protect the Delta, because only through the voice of the legislature and only through making sure that we are not going to harm the Delta with the peripheral canal can we protect them. I want to thank, real briefly, since I won't get another opportunity to do this, Senator Lois Wolk and Assembly members Bill Berryhill and Wes Chesbrough, who authored AB 13, which won't be heard on this floor, which will be killed in this process. But know that voting on this amendment will fix the elephant in the room.
Thank you, Ms. Huber. Your time is up. Mr. Tirico, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move to lay the amendments on the table.
Is there a second? It's been moved and second by Mr. Krikorian. It's not debatable and take the majority of those. It takes a majority of those parliamentary inquiry. Ms. Huber.
A yes vote on this motion to lay the table means to kill the amendment, and a no vote means to amend, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Tirico. Mr. Tirico is asking for a aye vote. Mrs. Huber is asking for a no vote. Takes a majority of those present and voting. Clerk will open the roll. Mr. Tirico is asking for an aye vote. Mrs. Huber is asking for a no vote. Mr. Tirico is asking for an aye vote. Mrs. Huber is asking for a no vote. All those voters are to vote. All those voters are to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 36, noes 14. Amendments are laid on the table. On the bill, the clerk will read.
Senate Bill 1 by Senator Simonian, an act relating to public resources and making an appropriation therefore.
Mr. Tirico.
Simply rise to request unanimous consent to allow Mr. Huffman to take up SB 1 without reference to file with amendments.
Clerk already read the bill. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, it's late, but I do believe that of all the late nights and long sessions we've had in this very interesting year, this is going to be one of those occasions where it's been worth the wait, where it's been worth the long, long hours, and in fact the months and months of hard work that has led us to this very auspicious moment. And I do believe it's an auspicious moment for our state's, certainly for our state's most important estuary, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. This is an ecological resource of world-class significance and importance, akin to the Florida Everglades or any of the biogems anywhere in the world. And it's the source of drinking water to 23 million citizens of this great state. The Delta is at the heart of the water crisis we face in the state of California because it is the hub of our water supply and it is such a critical estuary. And its problems are compounded by the fact that we are in the third year of a very serious drought. I don't need to tell the members of this body about the effects of that drought, and especially in places like the Central Valley, where the drought has combined with a terrible economic recession and the collapse of the construction industry to create major, major hardship and even breadlines reminiscent of the Great Depression. Meanwhile, California's $250 million salmon fishery is closed again this year for the unprecedented second consecutive year. And scientists warn us that without major changes in the way we manage the Delta, there'll be a cascade of fish extinctions, including our prized salmon and steelhead runs in the years ahead. Meanwhile, the Delta, with its 1,100 miles of fragile levees, is facing the possibility of a Katrina-like disaster if key levees fail. And experts tell us that there is a greater than 60% chance that an earthquake could cause just that type of levee failure in the decades ahead. That is, of course, if a storm or other event doesn't cause the levees to fail before that. Compounding the anxiety of all of this, of course, is our great uncertainty about how our state is going to meet its future water supply and how we're going to balance our critical environmental goals as we go forward. The package of policy bills before you today is the legislature's attempt to forge a way out of this crisis. And inevitably, when you tackle something this big and this complex, It's going to seem to some folks like it's rushed. But in truth, the process that is culminating tonight in this institution has been developing for many months. It's been subject to numerous hearings, probably more than any other bill we've voted on in recent years. And none of this was made up on the fly. In fact, we're not even working with ideas and proposals that were made up in this building. We're building on an impressive and very specific body of work that began 3 years ago when this legislature mandated a process that came to be known as the Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Task Force. It led to the creation by the governor of a bipartisan task force, chaired in fact by a former Delta legislator, and it culminated late last year with that task force's completion of a comprehensive strategic plan for the Delta. And we've spent much of this year working on how we can move forward with implementing the key elements of that strategic plan. We've had multiple informational hearings in our respected houses. We convened a 60-day bicameral and bipartisan working group. We met several times a week during that process, and we went through all of the recommendations of the 2-year Delta Vision process as we worked on how we might translate that important body of work into historic landmark legislation to address our state's water crisis. And I want to thank the members that participated in that process. I want to thank especially my colleague Gene Fuller and Jim Nielsen and the others who sat through long meetings where we heard from the state's leading experts about these problems. And we put our heads together, and the work that we did in that process indeed did shape the package that we are going to be voting on tonight. So let me just go over the elements of that package. First of all, this legislation creates a new Delta Stewardship Council to increase accountability, transparency, and, importantly, the role of independent science on decisions affecting the Delta. It addresses the problem that we have over 200 agencies at various levels that are involved in the Delta, but as Delta Vision concluded, everybody's involved, but no one is in charge. And
30
so they fought.
30 seconds, Mr. Huffman.
And so they fought over the Delta in court in a circular firing squad of conflicting policies and piecemeal plans. The new Governance Council in this legislation will put an end to that. They will develop a comprehensive ecosystem plan that for the first time looks at the recovery of species in the Delta instead of managing on a species-by-species, conflict-by-conflict basis. The ecosystem plan will take the fundamentally different approach of recovering endangered species instead of trying to avoid extinction. And that is the surest way to stabilizing the Delta as a water supply system for millions of Californians. Now, we know the Delta will remain a fragile resource for many years to come. And so this plan is premised on a policy of improving statewide water supply reliability and not just exporting water from the Delta.
10 seconds, Mr. Huffman.
Finally, the plan will include a Delta Conservancy. This bill includes a Delta Conservancy to acquire and manage habitat, a reconstituted Delta Protection Commission to ensure responsible land use planning, and also the important measures that we've already begun voting on tonight, a water conservation framework, groundwater reform, and soon, I hope, maybe tonight, important enhancements in the way we enforce our water rights laws.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Mr. Berryhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With all due respect to the people that have worked very hard on this, I'm adamantly opposed. You know, California is operating so good. We're running our state so great. What are we going to be, another $20 billion upside down? Now let's take over the Delta and see what a job we can do with it. For God's sakes, when are we going to quit expanding government and try to live within our means and try to let locals control their own lives? They obviously can do a better job than we can. You know, we talk about the process. Here we are in the dead of the night. There's no deadline like there is on a budget. For God's sakes, we ought to be, working this out, letting the details get worked out in the evening, and then dealing with it tomorrow with clear heads and clear minds. This process is horrible. What will this do? What will this legislation do? At the end of the day, what we fear in the Delta, and I understand where the South comes from on this, but at the end of the day, if the bond doesn't end up passing, what we get left with is a giant bureaucracy in our backyard. that ends up having the power to level fees and fines on the locals with no control. I wonder how any of you would feel if we came in with an agency into your county, your city, and told you what kind of water you had to drink or how you had to control your region through perhaps elected people from San Joaquin, Stanislaus County. We have very little representation over our own region. This is wrong. This is bad government. And this, at the end of the day, this bad policy does not produce one drop of water. A canal does not produce one drop of water. There are things we can do in California to get people working and get water flowing. There are jobs, there are projects all up and down this state, whether they're efficiency projects or whether they're new water projects, whether they're recycling. There are a number of things we can do in California south of the Delta and wean the South State off all the water coming through the Delta. I get that that's a smart idea, but to be dependent and continue to be dependent on the water flowing through the Delta is a bad idea. So, you know, this is frustrating to watch how the Delta representatives have been kept out of this debate, how they've been kept out of the process. That is not good. I know you've all worked hard, but at the end of the day, the farm workers down in Huron, Mendota, Fireball, hey, you know what? Those guys work hard too. And guess what it got them? It got them a place in the food line because they don't have water. And I guarantee you, we're going to look back in 10 years and we're going to see this, and we're not going to have a drop of water because it will be held up. Guess what? The governor has the appointments to the State Water Board. The State Water Board will determine what projects are done. You know what? I don't know. I'm a Republican. I like to be an optimist and think that my governor
1 minute, Mr. Berryhill. 1 minute.
Will be elected, but chances are he very well may not. And I don't like the idea of Jerry Brown saying I'm good with building dams. This will not produce one drop of water. I feel sorry for everyone down south that's been hoodwinked into believing it will. I urge a no vote. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you. Mr. Nilo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If in our rush to protect the Delta and provide assurances to the water supply of Delta export users, which, by the way, is what the co-equal objectives are, if in that rush we are running roughshod over the water supply security of the upstream users, I would suggest this is a false bargain. Now, first of all, we're creating a huge bureaucracy, perhaps to corral many different entities that are involved in this, but it's a huge bureaucracy that can have potentially a say in anything from the shape of levees in the Delta to housing developments in San Diego. Our attempt to provide assurances to the environment, to environmental interests, as well as Delta export interests, we are leaving out the very important water security of the upstream users. Now, it's true that the amendment, one of the amendments here in this bill, does restate the water rights of the areas of origin. But I stated in my previous, my comments on the floor on previous legislation that this is akin to acknowledging the fact that we do have the right to own an automobile, but we will implement measures that will restrict our ability to use that car that we have the right to own. That is, in effect, the nature of the assurances or lack thereof. I would suggest that the circular firing squad referred to by my colleague from Marin County what has indeed been reoriented in its targeting, but rather than a circular firing squad, they have all turned around in a line and pointed their guns at the water security of upstream users, the areas of origin. I recommend a no vote.
Thank you. Ms. Imada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Before I make my remarks, I would like to preface them by saying that I do not doubt the sincerity and the hard work that have gone on during this past year, which have now resulted in this package of extraordinary session water bills. I hope that all of the members here have had an opportunity to read them. But I rise, probably predictably and regrettably, in opposition to SB 1 for these reasons. I know of no other area in California that would cede governance to a non-elected and unaccountable body over, and may I have permission to refer to a map, Mr. Speaker?
Without objection.
Thank you. Members, some of you have been provided copies of the Delta map, which is constituted under the 1992 Delta Protection Act that is in existence now, with the primary and secondary zones. What we would be doing by supporting SB 1 this evening is establishing a new Delta Stewardship Council that would cede authority for governance to a non-elected, non-representative body over this land area, which we all know is very critical to the water future of California. I happen to represent 2 counties out of the 5 Delta counties and approximately 1/3 of the land area in the primary zone. I share the primary zone with my colleague, Assemblymember Joan Buchanan, who I believe also has her microphone up and can certainly speak for herself. But members, I will say this. The policy that has been crafted that is represented in SB 1 is frankly one that was crafted behind closed doors, despite my learned colleague, Mr. Huffman's recitation of the years long of work that went into crafting this policy. Again, I don't doubt that. Unfortunately, as one of the Delta members, we were not included in this bicameral, bipartisan water working group that, frankly, I still don't know who the members are, since an official list was never published. But I just say to you, does it not raise some questions in your mind when not a single Delta legislator that truly represents the primary zone are authors in any of these water bills? Would any of you, like people from the outside of your district, coming in to craft and be architects over the future of your district? I would say not. It is generally customary when members come into another member's district that you give someone a courtesy to say, you know, I'm coming into your district. I think that we could work together on some issues. I'm planning on visiting, whatever. You know, it's just a common courtesy. But I will tell you, members, that with all due respect, and I know President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg has joined us, he has indicated, good evening, Mr. Steinberg, that he is the Delta legislator representing the area. However, on another map, I can point to a very small portion of the secondary zone that Mr. Steinberg represents. Again, I do not doubt your sincerity or the sincerity of anyone that's been working on this issue. But without the support and the collaboration and concurrence of Delta legislators, I think this SB 1 reflects a very hollow policy and one that establishes a very poor precedent.
45 seconds,
Thank you,
Ms. Imada.
Mr. Speaker. Establishes a very poor public policy precedent when policy is worked out behind closed doors in a Big Five process rather than in the light of day. I therefore respectfully ask for a no vote. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. Mr. Fuhrer.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I rise, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, pretty much, yeah, no, fair enough. I wanted to rise to focus on the fact that the bills before us tonight really underscore how interconnected our state is when it comes to water, and how we both rely on each other, need to bolster each other, and need to reduce our dependence on each other. As a Southern California legislator, I want to comment on an observation that was made earlier by one of our colleagues about how we might be viewed by history 10 years from now. And our colleague stated that he thought we wouldn't be viewed in a positive light if we were to pass this legislation tonight. I think just the opposite is true. Given where we are in the history of our state and given the decline in the Delta, of which we're all aware, if we fail to act tonight, we'll be judged by history very poorly. And as one who represents Southern California, I looked at the conservation measure earlier, for example, as an instance where we're doing everything we can to try to find ways to reduce our dependence on the Delta. That is part of the equation that this package is designed to address. But another part of the equation is to bolster the ecosystem in the Delta, to help restore the Delta, to help us to revive all the elements that Mr. Huffman delineated in his remarks. To do that, this bill is a necessity. It's not an option. It's a necessity for us to do. Without doing this tonight, we're going to continue to perpetuate the decline of the most fragile ecosystem in our region, and as we know, the major estuary in this part of the world. So I rise not as a representative of any particular part of the Delta, certainly, but as a representative of a part of the state where we rely on each other, but part of that reliance needs to be to reduce our dependence on each other. And part of that reliance needs to be to support each other when we're in trouble. The Delta's in trouble. We need to fix it. This is a start that's absolutely essential, and I urge an aye vote.
Very well. Mrs. Buchanan.
Thank you. You know, it's not often that you get labor, AFSCME, SEIU, CTA, CSEA, Teamsters, the California Chamber of Commerce, the Farm Bureau, the Western Growers, the Wine Institute, a whole host of cities and counties and special districts that all agree. But they all agree that this is a very flawed bill. And this is why it's flawed. And permission to just hold up this chart for a minute. I've left it.
Without objection.
This is the bureaucracy that has been created to oversee the Delta. It's a bureaucracy that is underfunded, in fact, not really funded at all. It relies on annual appropriations by the legislature, but of course we don't want to know what that costs. And it's a bureaucracy that was created, if we are one state, without virtually any input from Northern California or the Delta. In fact, the BDC plan, which it's going to adopt, is being written by three-quarters of the people who are writing that plan are from Southern California, not Northern California. The Delta Stewardship Council has one representative from the Delta, 4 appointments from the governor, 2 appointments from the legislature. The Delta has been underrepresented in the process, a process which I would say has not been open and public, a process that when we did have the hearings, those people who were supported were invited to participate in panels, but if you opposed it, you had to speak in public comment. A process that's been flawed and has been underrepresented by the Delta. In addition, we talk about our future water supply. As my colleague points out, that conveyance will not generate one more drop of water. We talk about the co-equal goals of restoring the Delta and providing a reliable water supply and reducing our dependence on the Delta. But there is not one action in any of the bills tonight that we are passing, from conveyance to monitoring to any bill, that ties that action to reduce dependence on the Delta. There are no guarantees whatsoever that we will need less water from the Delta. This bill is a clear path to a conveyance. It says so in your Republican analysis. It says so in the bill. A conveyance is 48 miles long. That's 1,300 feet wide. That in some spots is 55 feet above the ground. Now, I ask all of you, is that a conveyance you want built in your district? It has a goal of restoring the delta by the year 2100. I'm not going to be alive then. My children aren't going to be alive then. My grandchildren probably are not going to be alive then. And there are no interim goals built in the plan to measure that progress. There is no accountability or responsibility. We passed Prop 1E in 2006 that had $4.1 billion for flood control and restoring the levees. We still have $3.6 billion that has not been issued. We have money if we want to start fixing the delta and shoring up the levees.
One minute,
I
Ms.
guess
Buchanan.
what disturbs me the most is this whole process. This idea, it's one thing to negotiate a budget behind closed doors. We did it with prisons, now we're doing it with the delta and water. What is next? You know, we were elected by the people to make the decisions. They didn't elect the big five. They elected us. They expect us to have hearings. They expect us to be transparent. They expect to be able to have input. They expect us to read the bills. Let me read to you from the Ledge Analyst. Please note that this version, which was completed early this morning, will need to be updated to correct some minor mistakes I have caught today.
20 seconds.
The final version will be available on Ledge Info at some point in coming days. Do you not think we have an obligation to read the language on a bill that's going to affect the people and the economy of this state for the next 100 years? That our constituents have a right to be able to read what we're voting on and have input? It's a flawed process. We need to go back to the beginning. We need to do this
Thank you,
right,
Ms.
and
Buchanan.
we need to do it in the light of day.
Mr. Arambula.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this measure, and I would like to ask that we consider our options. One is, don't vote for this. Accept the status quo. What does that give you? It gives you an ecosystem in the Delta where one species after another is collapsing. We have one federal decision after another imposing additional restrictions on transfer of water to Central and Southern California. And we are one state, ladies and gentlemen. And it's also causing reductions in water transfers to the point where the western side of the San Joaquin Valley that I represent is getting 10% of its water allocation this year, causing several $100 million of loss of agricultural commodities and the loss of jobs totaling in the tens of thousands. From agriculture, not construction, agriculture. I would invite those of you that have any doubt about the need for this bill to come and serve food in the food lines and look at the eyes of men and women who wait patiently for hours on end for cornflakes and other surplus food to last them until the next distribution. You think the Great Depression was bad. You have areas in my district with unemployment, official unemployment, approaching or exceeding 40%. And keep in mind, everyone tacitly understands that the vast majority of agricultural workers are not documented and by definition are not eligible for unemployment, so don't show up in that official 40%. So if we want to keep the status quo, let's reject this measure. If we want to see the ecosystem collapse even further, and God forbid that there should be an earthquake any minute or any day, causing the total collapse of the Delta, imperiling the economy of the state of California for several years, to the tune of several $1 billion worth of damage to our economy, not the Delta economy, not Northern California or Central or Southern California, to the California economy that we all represent. or we can adopt this measure, which has as its goals two co-equal goals: to restore, protect, and enhance the Delta ecosystem, and to provide more reliable water for those that need it. 2/3 of the rainfall falls in the north, 2/3 of the population in California lives in the south. We need to find a way to protect the Delta environment and assure reliable transfers of water to those that need it when they need it. I urge you to consider voting for this measure because the status quo is no longer acceptable. It has taken a great deal of time. This is my 5th year in the Assembly, and it has taken years to get to the point where we are today. It's one thing to say I don't like the process because you don't like the outcome of the process. But let's be real, let's be candid. Let's understand that if we reject this, the people of California are going to hold us accountable. We have a 13% approval rating for one reason. We're not willing to deal with the tough issues that this state faces. And to say that we will allow politics to decide what's going to happen instead of science,
30 seconds,
to me, represents the status quo. If we want to move forward, let's adopt this measure. Let's put those decisions in the hands of scientists that will allow for those two co-equal goals that we all need and support in this state.
Thank you. Ms. Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want you to consider this, the precedent that we're setting today. No other regional governing body has ever been established that didn't have significant local representation on it. Imagine you're creating the Coastal Commission, and on that Coastal Commission, you're going to put representatives from Bakersfield, from Fresno, and from Redding. How do you think the people on the coast feel when the people who live there, whose livelihoods depend on the coast, whose economy is so tied with the decisions that are made on that coast feel when the people who made the decision live in Bakersfield, Fresno, and Redding? Because that's what we're doing here today. It is no different, and we have never set that precedent before, but that's exactly what this bill does. Second, I want you to reject the false dichotomy that the only option is status quo or this bill, because it's not. There is no urgency that we have to put this new governing structure into place tonight. We could include the Delta representatives at the table. I think Senator Lois Wolk would have liked to have been in the Water Conference Committee. We could include the people who can really bring all of the stakeholders in the region together to come up with a governing structure that makes sense. Having people from outside the region dictate what's going to happen in that region just doesn't make sense. You don't have to choose. No one is advocating for the status quo. No one says that we don't need a new governance structure to make some of the decisions for the Delta region. What people are rejecting is a governing structure that doesn't include a significant amount of representation from the people who live there. I carried from my first day in office, I carried AB 642, which was addressed at exactly the same issue, making sure that the people of the Delta get to participate in some meaningful way on the governing body that's going to make the decisions. And here's what this governing body is going to do. Not only are they going to decide whether to approve a peripheral canal, they're going to set fees for water users throughout the state. There's going to be no legislative oversight, limited input from the public, and no vote of the people on whether to have a canal or not. Just imagine a 100-lane freeway right through your district and your constituents don't have a vote. That's what we're doing with this policy today. Third and finally, I also want you to not believe that this policy is somehow magically going to solve all the problems that are happening in the Delta. None of this policy does anything to guarantee that you have minimum flows through the Delta, which all the scientists agree are necessary for the health of the Delta. That's not what this is set up for. This is set up to find a way to export more water, not an ounce of new water. Just realize how monumental the decision you're about to make is. When you create this new governing structure,
Ms. Huber, 1 minute.
and you don't include the people in the Delta in the process, I urge you to vote no.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gaines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I stand to urge a no vote on SB 1. A real concern that I have in having a Sierra Nevada district is an overreach of regulation with regards to the area of origin for water. And we had an earlier version of legislation that did just that. And there's nothing to prevent this legislature from giving additional authority to a Delta Commission that takes rights away from locals that represent the Sierra Nevada. There also are no provisions for sunsetting. We keep talking about the overgrowth of regulation here in the state of California, both the regulation itself but also the agencies. And will these agencies always be necessary for eternity? Where's the sunsetting provision on the set of regulations and on the agency itself so that we can review it to see if it makes sense to even have it in the future? We're looking at setting up 3 different agencies here: a Delta Protection Commission, a Delta Conservancy Commission, a Delta Stewardship Council. Where's the representation? Why aren't these individuals being elected locally so that we have some sort of say in terms of what is happening with water coming from the north? And remember some of the agencies that we already have set up. Take a look at CARB. Remember the debate that we had earlier in the year, and we had to plead with the governor on the promulgation of regulation that required $11,000 fix for gas pump vapor recovery, which captured 3% of additional recovery. We went from 95% to 98%. That's brilliant regulation. I mean, what a great way to kill jobs and small business owners here in the state of California. And then let's take a look at the water resources and what happened with septic regulation. When we had an issue on the coast down the Malibu area with regard to septic effluent getting into a waterway, and we promulgated regulation that was going to be one size fits all for the state of California, requiring that 1.3 million septic users have their systems inspected, even though we have environmental health departments in 58 counties throughout the state, and the one size fits all design would cost $35,000. We still haven't resolved that issue. And then when we talk about unemployment and the fact that farmers and farm workers have been unemployed, I truly am concerned about that. But that was a man-created decision by a court. And the Endangered Species Act, which has been a true overreach. The endangered species in California and across the nation has been humans. How are we going to provide for families in the state of California? How are we going to provide jobs for people in the state of California? How are we going to provide that balance between the needs of individuals and our environment, for which we have to be good stewards of, obviously? But I just cannot support setting up a whole new matrix of regulation in probably the worst economy since the Depression, when we were going to have the authority to tax and to regulate with no local representation. I am in support of coming up with a solution. I think the solution, as expressed by my colleague Mr. Berryhill, could be a very inexpensive and prudent solution in terms of making sure that we have additional water supply and that we address the needs for the Delta. And I'm more than willing to address those issues and solve that problem. I urge a no vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines. Mr. DeVore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'd like to expand on some of the comments made by my distinguished colleague from Northern California, as well as some of my distinguished colleagues from the Delta area. I think it's important to point out that the Delta Stewardship Council, as presently constituted in SB 1, 7th Extraordinary Session, is at present not terribly threatening. However, what we're doing is we're creating a Trojan horse. A Trojan horse that in subsequent legislatures will no doubt be given additional power. A Trojan horse that does not have elected representatives on its body. A Trojan horse that will come to resemble, I think, the power that we see in the Coastal Commission and the Air Resources Board, that together with our high tax rates have caused entities like Forbes magazine to label California the 50th worst place to do business in America. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Delta is in fact the arterial network through which flow the vast majority of California's water that often needs to be shipped to various places where it's needed, for whether agricultural use or industrial use or for use by our urban areas. One of the things that concerns me with this bill is that I think we're looking at a solution in this case that isn't targeted at what we really need. What we really need, we've been talking about for decades. We need additional storage and additional conveyance. Now, later on this evening, we'll be voting on a bond that has grown magically by about $2 billion in the last few hours. I think it's up to $11 billion now, of which less than 1/3 is actually for additional storage. And one of my concerns is that the power that we're granting to this Delta Stewardship Council, which will no doubt grow in the future, may serve to frustrate the very reason why we're going to probably pass a bond out of this House later tonight.
Mr. DeVore, speak in reference to the bill before us today. Thank you.
And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I just said that what we're about to pass may in fact frustrate the bond that we're going to later consider. So what we need to consider with what we're voting on right now is that we're setting up a bureaucracy that will only get more powerful, a bureaucracy that will probably within our lifetimes begin to encroach upon both agriculture and business, and a bureaucracy that may frustrate the very reason why some of us may vote for a $11 billion bond later tonight, of which less than 1/3 will actually go to storage. I urge a no vote on this measure.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman, would you like to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this has been a great debate. This is, after all, water, and Mark Twain tells us what water is for. I respect the passion, I respect the legitimate concern of all of those who have expressed their perspective tonight. But there's one thing I do want to push back on and set the record straight in a very specific way, and that is the idea that somehow the Delta has not had a voice in this process, because that's crazy talk, folks. The Delta Vision process, I think I mentioned, was chaired by a former Delta legislator, Phil Eisenberg. All right? They had an extensive outreach process that included stakeholders from throughout the Delta. Senator Simitian, the author of this bill, over the past year or more, has had over 14 different stakeholder meetings attended by Delta lobbyists and citizens. I myself have visited every Delta county, met with every Delta water agency, every lobbyist that represents every interest, I think, conceivably in the Delta. During the course of this year, Delta legislators have sat on my committee and have engaged fully in the informational and policy hearings, and there have been many of them. During the 60-day bicameral, bipartisan working process, the Delta was represented by Assemblymember Buchanan, and of course, very ably, by Senator Lois Wolk. And the two Delta senators, Wolk and, of course, the pro tem, have certainly had a greater mark on this package of reforms than anyone else. from the name of the council, which is now the Delta Stewardship Council. That was a Lois Wolk inspiration. To the membership of the Delta Conservancy, to the way the Delta Protection Commission is constituted and gets special consideration in development of the Delta Plan, right down the line. To the fact that the authority of this council we've created, the Trojan horse we heard about a minute ago, is far less than what the Delta Vision process recommended. In fact, it's very disappointing to me. I think it ought to be a much more robust governance entity, but it only has appeal authority. And quite frankly, these were political decisions to scale back its authority because of the voice that the Delta had in this process. And I could go on and on. There are many, many new safeguards for the Delta in this process that do not exist today. And what it comes down to, folks, is interests in the Delta may not have gotten everything they want, but at the end of the day, some of them simply don't want change. And the one thing I can tell you is that change is coming to the Delta, whether we pass this legislation tonight or not, and whether that change is from a catastrophic levee failure or whether that change is from federal courts intervening because a cascade of extinctions coming from our critical fisheries, or whether that change is from any number of other accidents or failures in the Delta is going to hell in a handbasket. So the question is, do we want the kind of change that the experts tell us is coming if we don't act, or do we want to step up to this historic crossroads and do our job by passing this very thoughtful and, yes, modest plan to probably face the most important water crisis of the past 50 years. It's not revolutionary, doesn't go nearly as far as many of us would like, but it represents the very minimum actions that we must take at this critical juncture for California's water and California's most important estuary. You know, we're from all over this state as I look out on this room, and we don't agree on much. But I think the one thing that we can agree on, Republican and Democrat, north, south, inland, coastal, is that the Rolling Stones are the best rock and roll group in history. And of course, the Rolling Stones told us exactly what to do here. They said you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need. This is a package that gives the Delta what it needs. It's a package that gives our critical salmon fishery,
One minute,
for the
Mr.
second year in a row, what it needs to be recovered. The most important estuary in the west coast of the Americas is going to finally get what it needs. So I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Ms. Buchanan, is this a parliamentary inquiry?
Point of personal privilege.
Without objection, 2 minutes.
I was on the initial governance board before the conference committee. However, the meetings were scheduled at a time when another committee of mine was meeting, and I was not able to attend. And you know, we were never given documents or any follow-up. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you. Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Speaker, the fact is we had a certain member that was embroiled in a very intense campaign during those meetings, and the schedule didn't always work out. The record will reflect.
All debate having ceased, clerk will open the roll. All those vote who desire to vote. 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 Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 44, noes 26. Measures adopted. On Members, we are prepared to lift a call on Senate Bill 6. We're prepared to lift a call on Senate Bill 6. Clerk will post. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes, ayes 44, noes 25. Measure is adopted. Members, we will recess for an hour while we check the language on the final two bills. We'll come back, we'll take up the two bills, and then we will adjourn. We'll come back at 12 a.m., midnight. Okay, the House stands adjourned. Stands in recess. House stands in recess. Green light, yes. House stands in recess. Members, House stands in recess. We'll return at midnight. On time. On time, members. On time. Very well.